Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Cooper, and I'm the lead of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University. We are so pleased to be hosting the 2018-2019 Learning Exchange Series for the Forest Climate Working Group. Welcome to the webinar. If this is your first one, we're very glad to have you here. Quick background, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active in carbon markets. The group has worked together for 10 years to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. Please reach out if you have any questions or you think your organization may be interested in joining. As you can see on the slide, we've had a full lineup in the 2018-2019 year, and you can check out more details on these on our website, including recordings of past webinars. And you can also sign up for the remaining sessions on our website as well, and you'll receive a calendar invite when you do so. A quick note that our next Learning Exchange Series webinar will take place on June 5th and will feature Michael Catania, the Executive Director of Duke Farms, and he'll be sharing a case study of natural climate solutions in New Jersey with a look at rejoining Reggie and the Duke Farms property. Again, you can register for these sessions now, and we'll also be sending out a follow-up email with a link to our website following this webinar. And so just to move into our session today, we are really excited to introduce our speakers. We have Josh Parrish, the Director of the Working Woodlands Program at the Nature Conservancy, Rita Hite, the Executive Vice President of Woodlands for the American Forest Foundation, and Christine Cadigan, the Director of the Northeastern Woodland Conservation at American Forest Foundation as well. And they'll present on the Family Forest Carbon Initiative. We're really excited to let them get started, but before we do, I'd like to share a few housekeeping details. To automatically receive registration details, you're welcome to join our mailing list for any information on upcoming webinars, and that's at forestcy@msu.edu. For those members of the Society of American Foresters, this session is qualified for 1 CFE credit, and so if you're registered for this webinar using the email you have on file with SAF, this will automatically be credited to your account. However, if you have any issues, of course, you can reach out to us or to SAF to ask any questions. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the web along with any supplemental materials such as presentation slides or links to any reports that are mentioned. And if you've registered, you'll receive an email letting you know when this happens and where to find it. And another note is that this question will be followed by a quick Q&A. We'll reserve at least about 10 minutes. And so for this, we're kind of demonstrating here on this slide, you'll see the word chat on your Zoom interface, and sometimes this little bar disappears on you. So if you can't see it, you might just need to hover your mouse at the top or bottom of your screen. And this chat feature has a little drop-down triangle next to it. Here you can offer up questions at any point, so we strongly encourage you to put in a question when it comes to mind, and then we will compile and present questions to the speakers in the Q&A session at the end. If you're calling in on the phone but you have access to email, please feel free to send questions to forestcy@msu.edu, and we'll be monitoring that during the session. And a final note is, in case of outstanding questions, which does happen regularly, we will follow up with our speakers and have them provide written responses in a Word document, and we'll post that as a PDF along with the recording. So we still will get to your questions. And so with that, I think we're ready to hand it over. I know Christine's going to be sharing her screen and leading the way for the group. So Christine, feel free to share your screen and begin the presentation.
And I think actually while Christine's doing that, I'll just kick it off for us.
Great.
And just give a little context and background. This is Rita Hite with AFF, and excited to share the work that Christine and Josh have been partnering together on for a while now to build the Family Forest Carbon Program. And the context of this is, since the beginning of the Forest Climate Working Group, now 11 years ago, the Forest Climate Working Group always anticipated that we needed to come up with a diversity of solutions to really tap into the forest carbon potential in the U.S. In particular, given that not all landowners are of the same size and shape that we needed to come up with solutions that allowed for the diversity of landowners to participate. And so way back in the original cap and trade legislation that the Forest Climate Working Group was engaged in, we advocated for something at the time. It was called the Forest Carbon Incentives Program. There was also a title, something along the lines of Buy American Forest Carbon. The concept being, let's create a model for family forest owners, in particular small landowners who might have difficulty participating in the traditional carbon markets as they are currently shaped. Let's come up with a solution to ensure that we can tap into the forest carbon in those small family land ownerships in the U.S., which, as we all know, represent over a third of the land base, the forest land base in the U.S., and a significant potential for forest carbon sequestration and storage. So the Forest Climate Working Group long anticipated that we needed to find solutions to tap into this land base. We advocated for various pieces of legislation that created an incentive program like what we're going to talk about here today. And most recently, the legislation is still kind of alive on Capitol Hill, and that Senator Shaheen did reintroduce her legislation, the Forest Incentives Program, last Congress, and we're in conversations with her again this Congress. And obviously, there's an active discussion happening over in the House side as well. But the context here is even as we continue to pursue opportunities in the policy space to advance incentives to tap into this forest carbon, AFF and the Nature Conservancy came together and said, what if we were to start building this in the private sector and try to tap into buyers who are interested in family forest carbon in particular, supporting rural communities and family landowners? What if we were to actually start building this in the private sector, which could pave the way for the policy debate, but also could potentially stand on its own as well in the private sector? So that's the work that Christine and Josh have been pursuing, and just the context and the history involved with the Forest Climate Working Group, and why we're here today to talk about this opportunity. Is just a continuation of the great work and the great thinking that this coalition has done up until now. So Christine, I'll turn it to you to walk through the program.
Great, thanks Rita. Just quickly, I wanted to go over what we're hoping to cover on this webinar. Josh is going to start out by talking about the role of forests with climate change mitigation. There's a lot of great TNC science that he wants to share with you guys. The role of family forest owners in particular, our potential program impact, the program that Rita was just talking about that we're building and designing, how we designed it, how we're planning on piloting it, and then finally just thinking about the sustainability of this program into the future. So Josh, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Christine. And so, as Rita said, we're here today, working on and thinking about family forest owners and how to engage and enroll them in a way that helps us solve and mitigate the effects of catastrophic climate change. So, just a quick kind of science side on the role of forests, both globally and in the U.S. For a lot of folks on this call, this will not be new news, but just to reiterate the importance and really, I think the urgency for the Nature Conservancy and for AFF and for other partners of getting this right and having it both working in the private sector and available for public policy, as Rita said. So to get to the point where we're limiting warming to 2 degrees, or even now with the UN, the last report 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2030. We need kind of an all on board, all on deck strategies to mitigate climate. And so some slides here. The things that are already there and in the toolkit, we need more of them in massive scales like solar and wind and electric vehicles and other things of which fiber and things that are engineered carbon storage systems. But the one piece that I wanted to highlight was we have forests, we have trees, and it's a technology that exists and that if we keep forests in forests and we manage them in the right ways, there's massive amounts, and also replant forests, there's massive amounts of upside and climate mitigation potential. And the tree there is actually on my wife and I's property in central Pennsylvania. It's about a 300-year white oak, and that is our 4-year-old daughter trying to climb up it. So at least from my perspective, trees are incredible. They're resilient, and they're great at storing carbon. So next slide. So what's the potential? In about 2017, the Nature Conservancy and other partners published a global study looking at natural climate solutions and their ability to mitigate climate change through 2030. Really was kind of the critical, because everybody views that as kind of the critical break point for other mitigation, other technologies, decarbonizing the economy and the world. So through 2030, really the big picture piece is 37% of mitigation we need through 2030 can be achieved through natural systems, so these natural pathways. And then obviously after 2030, you can keep the amount of mitigation, but you need more and more mitigation from other substitution and other technologies over time. But in this critical point we're at right now, we really need a way to limit through 2030, and the natural climate solutions in that pathway are just a no regrets way to help the world get to a point where we're all sustainable and we can still live on the earth over time. So next slide. So what's that translate to here in the U.S.? This is a study that came out in Science Advances that Joe Fargione and others published last year that looked at forests, agriculture, and wetlands and their ability to mitigate climate. And it looked at it at really what's the potential with all the money in the world? What's the potential at $100? And what's a potential at a $10 per ton price point? And $10 per ton right now is kind of what we're using as a socially acceptable payment for mitigation. So when you look at all of this, the big opportunities in forests are with natural forest management, reforestation, and avoided forest conversion. And those are the things that we're working on through the Family Forest Carbon Program to improve and to basically create the mechanisms for family forest owners to participate and be part of the solution. As you can see here with the study, the impact, the positive impacts are just the potential's there. And currently, right now, as Christine will talk about, family forest owners really have no way to participate to be part of the solution here. So next slide.
So it's important when thinking about what Josh just mentioned and the role that forests can play in climate change mitigation is to assess where our biggest forest opportunity is. And it's no surprise to many of you that the ownership group that owns the plurality of America's forests are actually these families, these small individual forest owners, which again own the largest share of America's forests. And it's also important to understand where these lands are distributed across the U.S. While they certainly dominate the East, as you can see here, they're represented with the green color. They're also strategically present in very critical landscapes in the West as well. So being able to engage these family forest owners in opportunities for forest carbon and climate change mitigation projects is really essential. The challenge here is that most of these parcels are much smaller than some of the larger forest ownership groups, making it more challenging to work on the same landscape with multiple owners. So you can see from this graph, most of America's family forest owners, the parcel size is anywhere from 20 to 500 acres. So again, a much smaller, more dispersed, more parcelized group of individuals that we're working with. And it's also important to recognize that landowners all have their own objectives. And while we can go to research and leverage what we know motivates most landowners, so they enjoy their woods for beauty and scenery, for protecting or improving wildlife habitat, for privacy and other reasons, it's also still important to realize that all landowners are inherently different, and we need to build a program that meets these landowners where they are. And the carbon program may be a way for them to achieve these other objectives and goals that they have already set for their family and their property. So what's our potential impact? So thinking about the family forest ownership group and the science that Josh just introduced, excuse me, we estimate if we can achieve our ambitious goals of enrolling 20% of family forest owners by 2030, we can sequester 3.5 gigatons through the remainder of the century. And this is a really meaningful contribution to what our original Paris Accord goals were. So the family forest owners themselves provide a tremendous opportunity to make a real difference with these climate change goals. So how does our program work? In order to get these small landowners to sign up, the first thing we needed to do was acknowledge the barriers that they face to engaging in existing carbon markets, including the high cost of entry in the form of inventories, even more costly monitoring, as well as really long contract periods that don't always work for individual family ownership. So all of this led us to consider a practice-based approach. And unlike traditional forest carbon markets that count and monitor carbon stand by stand, so through this inventory and landowner by landowner, our program is designed on a landscape level across many smaller landowners. So it incentivizes landowners to implement specific activities or specific practices in the forest that will result in improving carbon sequestration over time. And just to reiterate, these practices and estimates are based and applicable by key forest types within a landscape. So they will change, the practices and the methodologies will change according to the landscape and the forest type that we're working in. So several willing landowners who are interested in participating in this program will implement these science-based practices that are verified by foresters. They'll all receive payments depending on the practice that they've signed up for, associated with those practices and where their kind of baseline was at the beginning or before they actually implemented the practice. But the corresponding validation, monitoring, and recalibration will all happen at this landscape level. So again, not parcel by parcel, but across all of these landowners in any given landscape. So we are testing this theory and testing this approach, in 2 specific geographies before we go too wide. There's a lot that we want to work out with the practices, with the landowner outreach aspect, with the systems and infrastructure that support the program overall. So we've determined that we want to work in 2 geographies, again, California and the Central Appalachians. And there are 2 specific practices associated with California and 3 practices associated with the Central App. So I'll let Josh go into more detail of those specific practices.
Thanks, Christine. But maybe before I get into the practices, just to point out again, the distinction between the current carbon markets and they're project-based. So every project is essentially a standalone entity. And what we're really talking about is having this landscape scale, practice-based approach, demonstrate over time, equivalent, climate and carbon benefits. And so when we were looking at this, the idea of practice-based approach, though, is not new to, for other environmental benefit programs. If you look at NRCS, if you look at programs like, nutrient reduction, on farms, they're, obviously NRCS and their partners are not going out on every farm and taking soil samples every year. I mean, they look, they develop the science, and then over time, through sampling, they improve the science, but on the average, they know the benefits for forested buffers and other things for agriculture. So I just wanted to point that out, that what we're the concept, the practice-based approach, it's, albeit it's new in the forest carbon realm. It's not new from an environmental perspective for investing in an efficient way, benefits, conservation benefits. So with that, I'll start, as Christine said, there's two pilot focus areas. One is the Central Apps, which we're starting in. Central Apps are big. It's like 50,000 square miles. So even that would be unwieldy. We're starting in central and western Pennsylvania, and then kind of the close, parts of, western Maryland, northern West Virginia, and northwest Virginia. It's kind of the Highlands areas there. And so in the Central Apps, what we looked at doing was we looked across forest types. We looked at current common practice from private landowners. And so we looked for gaps in areas where we could get, clear forest carbon benefits. And also obviously there's conservation benefits as well at large come with it. And we kind of came down on 3 practices. And I will say this, we could add more practices in the future, but we wanted to start with 3 that were kind of, practitioners and partners recognized as well, and that we could test and model in the landscape, and that landowners actually wanted our assistance with and wanted to enroll in. So the first one is called Reduced Impact Logging Carbon Real C. I'll say that this practice is actually already operational in the tropics. The Nature Conservancy designed this through the VERA standard. Carbon standard is a practice-based approach. So we're taking that and we're basically modifying it and putting it into the Central Apps. And what this is, reduced impact logging, is looking at essentially collateral damage after a harvest. So ensuring that you're doing the minimum amount of damage to the residual stand in the forest, and also looking at your footprint. So, instead of having, 6,000 linear feet of skid trails, how can you minimize that on a property? Still obviously manage the forest, but do it in a way that leaves more, high quality trees in the forest and higher amounts of basal area that are not damaged, and will, sequester less carbon over time. And we're working right now on the science behind that, but preliminary results look looks like there's a lot of potential for landowners to demonstrate forest carbon benefits through this reduced impact logging. So common practice, unfortunately, is not exemplary, and so this is a potential to lift the bar there. So next slide, Christine. So the second practice we looked at is extended harvest cycles, and what this is meant to do is help landowners think through and diversify their forest and continue to have a productive forest versus what we see as on family forests, unfortunately, in the east in our pilot area. It's mostly diameter limit cuts, or what we call thinning from above. It's mostly high grades, 60 to 70%. We just did some surveys and looked at the literature out there. Unfortunately, that's the harvest method of choice, and it leaves forests in a degraded condition, and that will just sequester nowhere near the amount of carbon over time that a well-managed forest, what we're calling here as extended harvest cycles, will produce. So landowners are it's a 20-year contract. If the landowner wants to, there's you can do one harvest. Obviously, it needs to be subject to a forest management plan and have real C utilized as well, or reduced impact logging practice when there is a harvest. So that the way we'll monitor this will be through looking at things like average diameter in the stand pre and post, square feet of basal area. So what's the volume of of trees you're leaving behind after the thinning. And all of that will then determine the payment to the landowner. And it will depend on essentially the residual trees left behind after the harvest. And the harvest itself will have to be a sustainable harvest. We won't obviously permit diameter limit cuts and things for enrolling in this, because unfortunately the science is pretty clear that over time, versus good sound sustainable forestry, the climate and carbon benefits are they're negative a lot of times, unfortunately, versus what we're talking about here, promoting this extended harvest cycles. Next slide. And then the third, and being a forestland owner myself in Pennsylvania and getting all over, talking to landowners in the East, it usually is not a day goes by that competing vegetation does not come up in discussion. So that's the third thing we looked at in the East. It continues to be, particularly with climate warming and growth. The growth zones continue to kind of go up. So everything's moving north in areas where competing vegetation might not have been as much of an issue. We have more and more competing vegetation issues of both native but also non-native invasive plants. So we're looking at there as a 10-year contract to landowners that looks at certain thresholds. For vines, we have a threshold of 20%. For understory conditions, if you already have or you're planning a future harvest, where it's a regeneration harvest, where you're really concerned about if you have this competing vegetation, you could actually get stand regeneration failure, or really small. We're looking at this as a way to help landowners manage the issues right now with actually growing a future forest. So this will be a 10-year contract, and it'll be administered through, as Christine said, a forester, and we'll monitor it. And obviously the end result is we want future forests to be growing there. And in the case of this picture, it looks like it's a sea of hay-scented fern, which to me is about 50% of north central Pennsylvania looks like that. It's aesthetically pleasing, but it's hard to grow young trees in those areas. Next slide. So I'm going to pivot now. This is not Pennsylvania you're looking at there in that picture. This is in California after catastrophic wildfire. And we're looking at two practices in California in the Sierras. So the first would be reforestation. This would be a 20-year contract. And this would be for areas that have, recently, suffered catastrophic burns. And, we would be working with, registered foresters in California to select, site-specific tree species, the number of trees per acre, and obviously the landowner themselves and their objectives on their lands. And then, with that, with planting trees where there are no trees now, unfortunately, because of wildfire, there'd be no allowable harvests in that 20-year period, except if there's issues around insect and disease and mitigating circumstances. Next slide. And then the second practice in California would be, this is really our thinning practice. So to reduce fire risk and also improve, kind of site resiliency for disease and other things. So this would be things like removing ladder fuels, removing unhealthy trees, and it would be all prescriptions by a registered, professional forester in California, with regards to things like, residual basal area targets and spacing of trees and things. It would also be looking at diameter distribution. So there'd be a maximum diameter limit required to protect larger trees to try to, obviously retain some of that stand diversity and size class as well.
Thanks, Josh. So when we're thinking about our landowner outreach and recruitment for participation in these programs, we consider the engagement level along this landowner stewardship journey schematic that you see in front of you. So some landowners that are interested in our program and want to access these resources may be more engaged and further along in this journey. And certainly we understand that while this is illustrating a linear pathway, a landowner's journey is anything but linear. But it really helps us organize our thoughts and understand where a landowner's coming in and how we can best service them at that appropriate time and get them ultimately to the goal of signing up for the program. So considering this stewardship journey, we've developed a landowner outreach plan to cater to landowners at various stages of this overall pathway in both of our pilot areas. In California, our landowner outreach program, which is titled My Sierra Woods, has currently deployed marketing to a total of about 800 prime prospects, 800 landowners. The marketing is still in the field as we speak, so we don't yet have results, but we should have them in the next couple of weeks here, I would think. And our digital outreach plan to complement some of that direct mail outreach is actually starting this month, which is pretty exciting. A subsequent round of direct mail will follow shortly thereafter. So we really are trying to get the word out pretty far and wide. For more engaged landowner prospects, so folks who are further along in this stewardship pathway, we've gathered a list of all of the registered professional foresters in our 9-county pilot area and are contacting them directly to introduce this opportunity to them and to their landowner clients. So that's where things stand in California. In the Central Appalachians, we've identified approximately 15 different outreach avenues to engage landowners, again, who are at various stages of this stewardship spectrum and are actively reaching out to stakeholders in this area to access their networks, get their feedback, leverage their existing relationships while planning to launch some very specific digital and direct mail marketing this summer, as early as June, actually. And all of this is happening as we are simultaneously building the systems and infrastructure necessary to contract with these landowners and to administer these contracts and make sure that the correct payment system and structure is set up for them. Here's a little schematic for generally how the program will work for any individual landowner. Once they sign up, they've already expressed interest, they've already selected the practice that makes sense for them and for their property. They get upfront money to cover the cost of the practice. Most of the practices that Josh went over have a high initial cost, such as the reforestation or even the competing vegetation. So we recognize that we need to help landowners implement that practice with an initial significant upfront payment to cover the cost of implementing the practice. We're reserving some of the overall payment for maintenance payment within the contract period, whatever that might be, anywhere from that kind of 1 to 2 to 20-year contract term. And that just sort of incentivizes them to continue to maintain that practice, to abide by the contract terms, et cetera, sort of a carrot to kind of keep them interested and invested. All the while they're producing this estimated carbon benefit, as well as a lot of very significant co-benefits, which oftentimes the landowners may even be more interested in. And Josh covered a couple of those co-benefits when he went through the practices. There will be periodic monitoring occurring either by a professional immediately following the implementation of the practice, which is just to verify that it's been done according to the silvicultural prescriptions associated with that practice, or later on by the landowner themselves, which I'll talk about in a second. So what does monitoring look like? Like I just mentioned, the verifying the practice will be done by a professional, by a forester. And you guys are probably very familiar with this concept. Something that NRCS does when they verify their practices, they send a professional out just to make sure it's done according to the prescription. So that will happen initially following the implementation of a practice. Following that initial verification, we are designing some low-cost monitoring, such as establishing GPS points where landowners can continually take pictures of the corresponding basal area or the results of the competing vegetation, for example, and send those to us at various intervals in the contract period. So a really low cost way for us to keep track of what's going on the ground. At the same time, we're also keeping opportunities and options open with improved data, technology, aerial monitoring, all of that. And I do want to say too that since this methodology, developing these methodologies for these practices is a relatively new concept, we are taking a sample of all of the initial participants and are going to do some more extensive monitoring associated with those individual parcels so that we can then go back and refine our methodology and make sure that it's as accurate as possible moving forward. And into the future, that could even mean adjusting the baseline and getting even more precise and more enhanced kind of carbon benefit into the future. So that's sort of a separate part of the ongoing science and research team associated with monitoring. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh again. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no. Thanks, Christine. So program sustainability. So we've got 5 practices spanning, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We want to do 54 million acres by 2030, but there's one other key ingredient here, and that is we need the resources. If we find the landowners and we have the practices ready to go, we won't get real far unless we have the funds essentially to implement the practices. And so I think as Rita had said in her intro, gave everybody kind of some background on kind of the evolution of this and the policy components. There's near-term opportunity, and the Nature Conservancy and AFF have been working on funding channels to get the program sustainable through the pilot period here in Pennsylvania and in California. So next slide, Christine. So, what we're looking at, what we're working on right now is really three different funding, three different funding buckets. And the first the bucket that that we're working with is foundations and individual donors to get this program from concept to on the ground pilot and then to grow the program. So we have some seed funding from key foundations, key individuals that see the benefit to creating a program that actually gets at scale climate investment where it's needed really the most, and that is with family forest properties in the U.S. So that's the first kind of investor in this has been obviously the seed investor. The second, and I think the real opportunity is working with corporations that have both climate goals, but also increasingly more goals around sustainability, around insetting, around water, habitat. Kind of the co-benefits of our program here as well. So we're working with them to design this program to produce essentially benefits that they feel comfortable investing in. And so right now we're building this out as we speak. So in a way, we're kind of, the way I usually say it is we're sailing the ship as we're building it right now, but we're working with key corporations that are really thought leaders in this space to design something that they feel comfortable investing in. And then to make that the next leap, and this is where Rita said on the front of the call, having the corporate support, having the foundation and individual support, and designing a program that works for family forest owners. There's the policy component of this as well, which I think, and it's in our long-term sustainability and fundraising to get to 54 million acres. We're going to need kind of all hands on deck on the ship, and that will also then include state and potentially federal investment for climate mitigation through family forests. So, things like the Climate Alliance states and states making setting targets and creating programs to reduce their emissions. We want to have this program there and available for investment for them as well, because I think there's a strong interest in reaching this segment. I mean, just like you hear about family farmers all the time now in the news, family forest owners, there's a strong interest in seeing that they are not, kind of left behind in this new, climate economy and other things. And this is a real opportunity to have this ready to go, functioning, and scalable. So I think that's our three sustainability buckets are really the traditional foundation, individual support, kind of the what we really see as kind of critical support, but also investment from corporations, and then the third piece being the policy component of this over time, and linking this with systems to help it really grow and expand. So next slide. So this just further kind of makes the point on this public-private partnership. We see the kind of corporations and state and federal government coming together here to really create something that without both of them together would never get to the scale we want, which is that 20% of all family forest owners are enrolled by 2030. Since we have 0% now, we need all the help we can get, and we are also preliminary discussions with landowner groups and other things. I mean, I think we're going to have lots of interest, so we need to make sure we have the resources available to basically enroll and service that interest with private family forest owners. The next slide.
Thanks, Josh. Just to kind of wrap us up, we thought we'd share some of the challenges that we're still working through. Obviously, this is a new program, a new approach, and we by no means have it all figured out, but are committed to working through some of these big challenges. The first one I think I alluded to earlier is just making sure that we have the right systems and infrastructure in place to administer these contracts to landowners, to administer the payments, the incentive payments, et cetera. So that's one of the things that we're actively working through right now. The other big challenge is for those 5 practices that Josh pointed out. Obviously, there's incentive payments associated with each practice. And so we're actively working right now to estimate what those payments would be, and also doing some social science research with landowners. This month, actually, we have that planned. We're doing a series of interviews, or excuse me, we're starting with a survey and then doing a series of interviews to see if there's an opportunity to pay less than the true opportunity cost associated with those, or opportunity cost or actual cost, realized cost associated with those payments. Because a lot of landowners are interested in doing and implementing these practices for their own objectives, for wildlife habitat, et cetera. And so they may be willing and interested in doing this at implementing the practice at a lower cost than what the actual true cost may be. So we don't yet have specific estimates for every practice, but we hope to have that wrapped up in the next month or two once we do some of this research and try to ground truth what actually motivates landowners to sign up for the program. And last but certainly not least is defining the product that will be attractive to investors. So what actually is the quantifiable carbon benefit that we're measuring, or excuse me, that we're offering to these investors? We've purposefully not really mentioned anything about a specific carbon credits. It's really about this quantifiable carbon claim associated with producing an offset. So we're exploring with a lot of stakeholders what that means, how it's defined, how we can get it verified, and may not necessarily turn into a credit as it's defined in the marketplace today. But as long as we have investors who are interested in pursuing these opportunities and buying what we have to offer, then that may work just fine for us. So again, a big challenge that we're working through, we don't yet have the answer to, but we'll certainly have that wrapped up in the next couple of months as well. So those are some of the challenges that we're working through as we really launch and build this program. And just to wrap up, kind of a summary slide here, that our practices are, this practice-based approach and the 5 practices that we've introduced are science-based. They've been working on them for months. They're going through a peer review process with other experts in the field. So we feel really, really strong about the methodology that's being developed, not just today, but our plan to refine it and our commitment to refine it into the future. So these will not be just, the methodologies will not remain as they are today, but they will be continually refined, and our estimates will have higher confidence as we implement the program. We feel like this is a really efficient mechanism to deliver incentive payments to landowners to implement these practices, as well as engage landowners in carbon programs. And we also feel like it's scalable. We understand generally what barriers to entry family forest owners are facing with existing carbon programs. And if we can reduce those barriers through this program, we can get a lot more landowners to sign up. And just as I mentioned, it is rigorous. We do have this monitoring and validation system developed on a landscape level. And again, we feel really good about how that's going to boost the confidence of the estimates that we're providing, of the carbon estimates that we're providing. And certainly it's relevant to small parcels. These family forest owners are who we had in mind when we were developing this program. So it was absolutely essential to make sure that we're reducing the barriers to entry for those folks. And certainly these practices, again, as Josh mentioned earlier, all provide a multitude of benefits in addition to the carbon benefit. And that's another thing that we're really, that's helping us sell this to landowner participation as well as other investors, is the co-benefits associated with these practices and with landowners implementing these programs. So with that, Lauren, I think I'll turn it over to you to help us with questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. This is a really fascinating presentation. We're getting a lot of interest. I can already tell you, I have too many questions. So I'll apologize in advance for those folks if I'm not able to get to your questions, but we will be following up with our speakers afterwards. So with that, I'm going to jump right into these questions. I think I'm going to start with a number of kind of management and implementation questions. And again, just a reminder, these rolled in while you were speaking. So in some ways you've addressed some of these questions, but I think it's nice for kind of a review as well to circle back on some of the key points that have stuck with the audience. So I just kind of throw this out here. But first are just a couple more detailed technical questions. One is, you mentioned that in one of the scenarios you would allow harvest every 20 years. And there was a clarification, is that 20 years per ownership or per management unit?
So it would be, the enrollment's going to be per management unit. So a landowner might own 200 acres but have 50 acres they want to enroll in our program. So it'd be per management unit. And the one thing I wanted to also bring up is the enrollment in the extended harvest cycles does not mean that a landowner has to harvest within that 20-year period. It basically gives them some flexibility and opportunity if they want to, based on their goals and objectives, whatever they may be, subject to parameters.
Great. And another question, we have a number related to monitoring and to implementation. So one is, what is the level of enforcement for an infraction on the contract? And relatedly, is the contract put on the title of the property, and what happens if the landowner moves?
I'll attempt to answer both those questions. And so this would be a contract. It would not be an easement or something that runs with the land, but the contract would be would pass to, let's say within that 20-year period, if you sell your property, it would come with the property as any other potential private agreement or contract would. A landowner could do something, as it was just stated, that would be, in violation of the contract. But what we'll have in there are essentially penalties and disincentives for folks to do that. So there'll be systems built in to make it to make it not appealing to to do the opposite of what we're trying to get at here. We have not developed all of those systems yet, so that is part of any good program is trying to prevent kind of backsliding.
That's useful. And then that kind of leads into a following question here is, how are you thinking about leakage? So that's the idea that if you have more intensive conservation activities in one location, you're just going to have increases in another location to meet market demand. How are you addressing that topic in this particular program? And are you concerned that limitations on harvest in your contracted parcels may change behaviors of other landowners outside of the contract?
So, leakage is an interesting, so we're modeling that as any good program would, let me say that at first, but leakage is interesting in this regards because common practice, which is diameter limit cutting, over time produces less and less and less salt timber and forest products. On a good stand, a lot of places you might get 2-3 high grades out of it, and then you're left with, there's science out right now from the Forest Service. After 3 high grades, and this is in Northwest PA, the stand in 10 years actually put on no growth. So it's negative growth in 10 years after that measurement. So, our scenario is going to continue to grow more wood. It doesn't prevent harvest, and actually over the long term, we'll have higher quality, larger diameter forests that are more productive. So it's an interesting, we're dealing with it, we're modeling it, but we're not concerned about that because we think, the folks that are, the common practice, the high grading that's happening essentially will eventually severely reduce the potential for more material, more harvest, particularly here in the Mid-Atlantic where I'm based.
Mm-hmm. And Lauren, to add one quick thing to that, if I might, we really only feel like leakage is a problem associated with that extended cutting, and not even technically a problem, but associated with that one particular practice. And one of the things that the science team is doing, in addition to monitoring the landowners who are enrolled and will implement that practice, is also monitoring what's going on outside of those who are enrolled, so that we can keep our eye on that and again refine the methodology and address that accordingly if it does become an issue.
Yep.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. Another question here is related, is how are baselines calculated across a landscape, and maybe in the case of when there's multiple family landowners, and how might this differ from the offset methodologies in the California market?
Baselines.
I can repeat that. So how are baselines calculated in this case for the contracted parcels? How are they calculated in this case, taking into account common practice, and how might this differ from the offset methodologies in the California market? I know you explicitly said you're staying away currently from the idea of carbon credits, but are the methodologies different from your perspective now, or will they be somewhat similar?
So there's two of the practices in the East look at what baseline scenarios look like, and that is reduced impact logging is one. It currently is not part of other carbon markets, so there's no we can't compare. But there we're actually doing field measurements around for harvests that we're not utilizing reduced impact logging or best management practices around harvest. So there we're setting the baseline through a rigorous, kind of wide review of literature plus field measurements. And then the other one that the question I think was really getting at, and that is the extended harvest cycles, that and how it differs from current carbon standards. Our baseline setting is looking at, landscape level harvests on private forests. It looks at literature out there. We have, and we'll continue to do more outreach to landowners to see what the baseline scenario is. And really the interesting thing about extended harvest cycles and this kind of, no thinning from above is, there's just, the climate benefits, the carbon benefits from the harvests themselves are what really is, penciled out over this 20-year term. And that we're still building out what those benefits are through our science and program team. So I don't want to get too far into details here, and it's just started to go out to scientific peer review. But the current carbon standards look at regional averages of stocking for forests, and then look at your property, how it compares to that. Then they reward landowners for having more than what's on the landscape. And then if you harvest less than than common practice in the landscape, they obviously credit you for that in the current carbon credit markets. So the practice-based approach will be different because it's looking at the impacts and the positive aspects of the actual practice. But there is the baseline scenario that you have to basically figure out. And so that was a long way of not giving you a great answer, and I apologize because we're going through it right now in the science side, and certainly we will share as this will all be public information to look at as we get it reviewed and refined.
Well, thank you for the context that you could provide. I'll maybe shift to something that's maybe a little easier to answer. We have a number of questions about the non-permanence, and then also specifically a couple of questions brought in the issues of insects and disease. So we're wondering how are unintentional reversals being handled in this program, particularly when you're looking at reforestation of fire areas or areas at fire risk and disease risks as well.
Christine, maybe I'll hand that one over to you for California. It's a good question.
Yeah, so to start with, the reforestation is only focused on areas that have experienced catastrophic burns, right? So we're only looking at those particular areas that wouldn't have otherwise, that currently have no trees growing on them at the moment, right? So the unintentional reversal of that, if an insect or disease comes through, we allow landowners who have signed up for that program to manage for that to reduce the impact that may cause. I'm not sure I'm actually getting to the bottom of what some of your questions are asking, Lauren.
So, Christine, I think the other thing that maybe this is involved in that question is, are we looking at like the forest carbon credit markets assigning landscape level risk to things like insect disease, wind, basically, acts of God, and that's being worked through as well with the science team to kind of come up with what the climate benefit would be over that period. So yeah, and and the other question I think was around permanence. This isn't, even the 20-year contract. What we're going to do is put in incentives for them to stay in our contract, but certainly landowners will have the right to not renew the contract after the 20-year period. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly, part of the design that will be factored in to the benefits, but it's also one of the things that we, in talking to private forest landowners and family forest owners, a major hurdle is cost, but also this long-term commitment of, I think ACR is 40 to 100-year commitment, all of which can be, even in the current climate, carbon credit markets can be canceled. But yeah, those are all issues around the rigor, the science, and the claims, and we're working on all those as we speak. Those are all top line, things that need addressed in order for this really to be credible. So I appreciate those questions, and as I said before, we're sailing the ship here as we're building it. So apologize I don't have all the answers.
No, I think this has been really helpful, and I do have just some more really wonderful questions here that we are not going to have time to get into, but even though we'll go over maybe a minute or two here, I did want to ask one more on the financial side of things, and that is about payments and transaction costs. So we have a number of questions along the lines of, do you have a sense of what a minimum ownership size would be, and who's going to deliver the program or pay for the admin side of things? And then from the landowner side, are payments going to be flat rates per practice per acre, or are you still considering modeling a price for carbon in some way over time going in the future?
So Christine, do you want to answer where this would sit?
Yeah, so that is something, developing that infrastructure is something that we're also currently exploring. We're looking at developing potentially a separate entity that would actually hold the contracts and administer the payments. So that's to be determined in the coming months, or less than that actually. The minimum acres are 10 acres for enrollment, although some of those harvests like real C or whatnot would, associated with the management unit, as Josh mentioned. The third part of your question, Lauren, was on payments, and I think you said per acre or associated with the carbon benefit. And right now, our payment estimates are the cost to implement the practice per acre.
Okay.
And how that would be distributed throughout the contract period. That wouldn't all come at once necessarily, but we could pay 60 to 80% of that in year one, and then reserve the remainder of the payment throughout the rest of the contract period.
Great, that's really helpful. And again, we have some great questions here that we're not going to be able to address, but we are going to kind of organize these a little bit, follow up with our speakers. We can also, I know that they're willing to share probably contact information. We're going to have the recording of this presentation as well, so you can review this again. And we also have a couple of folks that reached out more in interest in working with you. So hello to Cassie, who's worked with us here at MSU, who's based in Ohio. So we have some questions about where you might be bringing this program next, and some folks offering up connections in different parts of the country as well. So we'll be happy to share those with the speakers. And so, with all of that, I think we'll just wrap up for now so that we don't go over our time too much. I really want to take a moment to thank Christine, Rita, and Josh for sharing this work with us, providing us this context, and allowing us some insight into your activities, even though they're still underway and still unfolding. It was really useful to get this insight. And please reach out to us at forestc@msu.edu if you have any additional questions that come to mind afterwards. And with that, I'd also just like to thank the Forest Climate Working Group for providing the guidance and the infrastructure for this webinar series. And with that, I'll just thank the speakers one more time. I hope everyone has a great afternoon, and thanks for joining.